And cool.
Hi.
So I'm very happy to be joined here today by Rick Buccheri, mediator with ADR Vantage, and someone I used to work with in the past as a mediator. And so this is for the negotiation class at the UCL School of Management. I'd love to get started, Rick, by asking you to just introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. As you mentioned, I'm Rick Buccheri. I'm currently the director of programs at ADR Vantage. We're a small consulting firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. in the United States, and specializing in really three primary areas. So conflict resolution, organization effectiveness, and initiatives related to creating more diverse, inclusive, and equitable work environments. So most of the work I'm doing these days is workplace related, but I have a long background in community mediation and mediating all types of disputes.
Great. So what is your current role within the organization? What do you do every day?
Yeah, so as the director of programs, my role is really kind of divided between a couple of buckets. So one, I oversee sort of the administration of our service programs. And that's really inclusive of managing our roster of professional practitioners. So as a company, our staff, we have 5 people on staff, but we have a roster of nearly 170 professional practitioners that help provide service throughout the United States. And so I oversee and manage the work that they do. And also support business development, help grow the business, establish relationships with clients. And then the third bucket is direct service. So I am a mediator, a facilitator, a consultant, a coach, a trainer. So I'm out there working directly with clients and providing service directly myself.
So could you give us a flavor of what these kinds of services you provide are? How does someone end up in your care? How do they get from, I guess, what they're sitting at their desk one day doing their job and then suddenly they're on the phone with you? How's that work?
Yeah, so that could be really different depending. So historically, ADR Vantage has been a service provider to the federal government in the United States. And so we, submit proposals to do, to win contracts and do often like multi-year projects or to be like on retainer across, several years. And so, more recently, we've been developing our private sector practice, and that's, I have kind of an anecdote there of how we go. I guess real quickly, a CEO of a tech company in Wisconsin, realized that his company was growing and he wanted the company to become a conflict competent organization. And he was like, I don't know how we do that, but I have this vision of us being able to handle conflict whenever it comes up. And so he found us and reached out, and we've been doing a series of like trainings and facilitated dialogues with their company, as well as like helping them look at some of their policies and internal procedures and avenues for resolution. But often with the federal government, what happens is somebody might file a complaint, a formal complaint. It might be, EEO related, so related to equal employment opportunity. If somebody feels they've been discriminated against. And so that either goes through some central office. It might be an employee relations department, it might be human resources, it could be, a number of different things that, have us essentially on retainer as a vendor and can reach out to us to intervene, particularly in situations where they might feel that it's more helpful to have somebody from outside the agency come in because it's a particularly sensitive dispute or there's some degree of neutrality that's needed. So that's kind of the, how we get brought in. So that, could look everything from the CEO who calls us to somebody who goes through sometimes a really, kind of Byzantine, complex system of, bureaucratic loopholes to eventually get to us. And then the service that we provide, you mentioned mediation, and that's certainly one of the things that we do, something I do often and recently. But we also just do a lot of like broader interventions and support services. So lots of large group facilitation, with groups of all sizes. And of course, these days, most of that's happening virtually, which is, I think changing the nature of some of those interactions, but really allowing us to engage effectively with particularly large audiences. And lots of team building, strategic planning, coaching, lots of facilitated dialogues. I mentioned, DEI work. And so in response to, events that have played out in the United States over the past year, particularly the murder of George Floyd, lots of organizations suddenly started reaching out, wanting to give people a space to process what was happening, wanting to build policies and procedures that were, more inclusive and equitable. And so we support some of those initiatives as well.
Cool. So we've talked a little bit about mediation, or a lot about mediation in this class, of course, because they have me at the front of the room. I'm curious, you talked about some of these other interventions, large group facilitation. What is that? And what are the kind of situations that someone might say, oh, we need a large group facilitation? What does that look like?
Yeah, and those are my favorite because they're the murkiest. There's a whole range of things. So sometimes it might be we get called in because a team or department is underperforming, often in response to some workplace assessment. Like in the federal government, they have the federal employee viewpoint surveys that they do annually, and they get all this data, and often we'll look to, wow, this department is getting really bad ratings around morale. Well, what's that about? Let's call somebody in to go talk to people and put them in conversation with one another to address that. So it could be that. It could be, again, something like team building where a group has specific issues that they want to work on. So not team building in the sense of like a ropes course or that kind of thing, but team building in the sense of we as a team want to function more effectively together, and we have specific things that we're having challenges around. And so we want some support to help us have a conversation about those things, do some action planning together, and find and design some plans to improve those things. And then other times it could be, we are getting together for a retreat. So already we're starting to see organizations go back, so they've been virtual during COVID. Now they're starting to return to an in-person workplace, and they all haven't been in the same physical space for a while. So they're starting to reach out and say, we just want to bring people together in conversation, kind of reset, let's just talk to each other, and we need some help facilitating those conversations. So those are pretty wide ranging. I love them because a group reaches out to support, and often they might be asking for one thing, but then we do some digging and they need something else. And so those can be really exciting as they unfold.
Okay, cool. That's really interesting. I'm curious a little bit now about what are the end products of those. So this class is on negotiation, and and people often come into a mediation with a similar sense of we have a goal, we need to reach an agreement to get this deal signed. Although we do talk in this class about the agreement bias, right? There are some times when it's better to walk away, but we've also talked a lot about the value of building understanding. So I'm curious, what are the outcomes in these larger group type situations? When you said are your favorite, are they there to say, we need to make a plan and solve this problem? Does that ever happen? Does it work out that way?
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of times that is the, sort of impetus. If somebody says there's a specific thing that we want to address or we want to talk about, and then in the course of conversation, we find that there's lots of other things that the group as a whole needs to talk about. So, I would say that is a piece of the work, is we go in always sort of knowing that we need to do a little bit of digging and surfacing and finding out what are those underlying dynamics that are impacting how you all are working together. And then, I think similar to mediation, regardless of how many people are involved, there is some desire to get to not necessarily a written settlement, but to get to some action, right? And some action. So we need to do some action planning, and we need to get people committed to doing things differently than how they're doing things now. And so, where mediation often opens with, well, what's been going on and what's been happening in the past, what's happening now, and then eventually shifts towards the future. A large group intervention is going to happen the same way. It's, well, let's have some conversation around what's been happening, how are things happening now, and then at a certain point, once we have a good understanding of that and what people want the future to look like, that's different from how things are happening now, then let's co-design that future and then make that that could become a written document. It really depends on the group and what level of accountability they need.
And how much are you involved in that last stage of the process? You're actually helping people when it's appropriate. Are you helping them like write up that agreement, or do they kind of take the facilitated conversation and then go off and determine their specifics?
Yeah, I mean, it could be either of those things, and I think it really depends on the group. What's important is that the group and the participants of the group are the ones making the decisions, the ones deciding what the outcome is, deciding what level of support they need. So, at time, like if we're in a physical space, you might have chart papers all over the wall with like things that they've come up with, and they say, great, we'll take them and we'll do what we need to do from here. Other times, I might be the one sort of really documenting the things that they're agreeing to, and then present that back as the plan, but it's always with that sort of tentative, this is how I've interpreted it. If we need to have some more interpretation to help you all reconcile your own interpretations, we can do that. But
so I'm curious then, it sounds like you're dealing with a lot of different, just the variety of kind of scenarios you deal with is really incredible. And then even within that, sometimes it's the pairwise disputes, sometimes it's the big groups. How does your process or strategy differ for different kinds of circumstances, or does it? Or do you have kind of one tool that you use everywhere, or do you have to customize?
yeah, that's a really great tool, or a really great question. And it's interesting to me because, so I've been a mediator since 2006, and I didn't start getting into organization development until 2011 to 2013, and had done some large group facilitation before, starting in 2008. But in my mediation practice, I followed a strict model, had a very strict process. There were certain things that I do in that process and things that I really don't do, and I always sort of adhere to that. And one of the things that I've enjoyed about the group work is that because it's often so amorphous when it comes in the door, it sort of lends itself to having more flexibility and more creativity in what I bring to the table in terms of restructuring those conversations. And really in recent, like over the past year and a half, I've really started to give thought to, do I need to be more creative in my mediation process? Do I need to give more flexibility there?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I've been thinking about the same thing past couple of years. Please continue though. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, and I early in my mediation career would have a lot of pushback when people would kind of try to deviate from the model that we were practicing. And I thought, like, how dare you? We were taught to do it this way. This is how we should do it. But I've been exposed to other lenses, other ways of working with people. And one of the things that I love about the work is that because human beings are so different, because we all have different needs, we need to have a really wide toolkit to be able to adapt to people. I like having kind of a rigid process because it creates some boundaries and some structure to what we're doing. But then within that process, sort of give flexibility so that we can not deviate from the process, but not be so rigid that we only do things one way. And if that's not working, then we give up.
Yeah, to me, it's a lot like art or music. You have to learn how to play by the rules before you can learn to, operate outside them. And we definitely see this, when you're training mediators. Well, the person who walks in the room on day one is basically not playing by the rules, and it's so hard to get people to not give suggestions,
Yeah.
take these really directive roles.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's good. I mean, there are like hard rules that I hold on to, so that's one of them. Like, I'm not going to tell them what to do or tell them what I think they need to do. I'm going to help create some dialogue. So again, that's, I think, a nice sort of boundary, where it's like, that will always be a constant that sort of guides the work. But even with that rule, there's still opportunities to be, creative.
So what do you have in mind? So it sounds like you're not really willing to break the rule of giving advice or suggestions. What are some of the areas where you see more room for flexibility?
Yeah, so it means that, like, if I'm not going to be the one creating those ideas, then the participants need to be the ones. And if I ask them to come up with those ideas and they're not doing it, then I'm like, all right, then I need to approach it some other way. I need to give it a different frame. And I think in mediation we use often open-ended questions, and I use questions a lot throughout all of my areas of practice, and love inquiry, and like really like changing questions to totally help help people totally rethink something. And just as a recent example, this was in the scope of a training. So we were sort of demonstrating something, but we did a real live demonstration. And as a group, somebody presented a problem, and it was like a really personal problem. And so our instruction to the group was, we want you to come up with questions that you will ask of this person who presented the problem. And all of those questions need to start with the words, "How might we?" And inevitably, like, people would say, well, like, this is her problem, so how might you? And we'd be like, no, like, how might we? And they'd be like, well, how might your director? And we'd be like, no, how might we? And so they'd come back to that, and the nature of their questions like kept getting more and more, like, they kept getting like deeper and deeper into the situation, and they kept involving themselves more in their answers. So like they would say, like, how might we support you in resolving this? And then she'd go a little deeper into the story, and they'd be like, oh, how might we take that and do this? And so I thought, like, yeah, that was a really fun intervention. It was something that we had never quite done before in that way. And again, so we're not giving those ideas or advice or telling them what to do, but we're shifting the process just enough to help them do something different.
Yeah. That rings a little bit with some of my own experience. I'm curious if this rings true with you in terms of what you're talking about. I'm with you. I will never, or not never, but I will take a strong line against any directive or evaluative style, which means giving suggestions or advice. But lately, I've been feeling a little bit more comfortable in terms of taking a directive approach to the process, right? In terms of, and I think I'm pretty sure I covered process mapping in this class. That's always a tool at your disposal, but sometimes people do need a little bit of a firmer guiding hand, like, no, we're going to talk about this right now, or I acknowledge what you're saying, I'd really like to focus on this. Is that a little bit what you're talking about, like directing the process, or do you see, is that not right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, like, when I teach and train mediators, one of the things that I always try to convey is, like, you own the process. Like, that is your part where you have some authority. And I think, again, it's important for mediators and practitioners of variety of types to be responsive to our participants' needs and how something's landing for them, what their experience is throughout that process. And so it's not to punish people by forcing them to adhere to a process. But yeah, I think you're right that we do need to have some boundaries and be intentional about why we're sticking to a process or why we are deviating from it if we think that's important. And if somebody raised a topic that was sort of all away from the thing we're talking about now, and I wanted to say, like, let's just stay on this topic, but here's what I hear you talking about, and let's make space for that too. Let's be sure that we do come back and address that.
So I'm really curious, this reminded me a lot of the geekier stuff I've been thinking about, and then I'm going to control the process, direct us back to some of the more main questions I had in mind. I'm just watching the clock. We should wrap up pretty soon. I'm curious what your opinion is on reflecting facts and positions. So to give context to anyone watching this video, the way I teach it in this class is very closely aligned with the community mediation Maryland principle of you're really reflecting feelings, values, topics, and you shouldn't be saying anything else. Versus here in Chicago, the way they teach it is like right from the opening statement, you're actually you're giving a summary reflection of like everything the person said. Okay, so you were walking your dog and this lady came up to you and started screaming at you and said, get your dog off my lawn, right? They actually teach reflecting all of that detail, which, as you can imagine, is always challenging for me, or I would think for anybody, because it's always hard to state someone's position without sounding like you agree with it.
Yeah.
But as I've been engaging in the Chicago model, because when in Chicago, do as the Chicagoans do, I've learned a lot of the values of that and, you know, potential balance, although I'm still kind of parsing through. So I'm curious what your opinions on things like facts and positions and other kinds of reflections besides those really elemental ones.
Yeah, because you and I were taught in the same model, I too, you know, it's amazing to me, you know, that after like 14 and a half years, I still find reflecting feelings, values, topics as one of the most powerful interventions. And so it's certainly a go-to for me. And you know, and I think when I find myself reflecting positions, it's more when I can't quite articulate what those feelings, values, and topics might be. And so it comes off sometimes for me in a clumsy way. There was a very real example very recently where it was a mediation between a man and a woman where the man felt he was discriminated against by his female boss. And he brought up a situation, the words he used were, you know, in the meeting, she scoffed at what I said. And then my reflection was something around like, oh, it sounded like you were bothered and offended when she scoffed at you. And she really took offense at the fact that I used that language, and later complained, you know, to the EEO office that I had taken his side in that situation. And so it was certainly not my intention to, and I did a lot of work to make her feel heard and empowered in that conversation. But I think that's the risk in reflecting those positions. So yeah, I'd be curious to learn more about why that's such an effective intervention in Chicago.
So first of all, I love that example because it really highlights what I still believe is the risks of anything like that. And I will qualify for people watching this that I'm still like 95% feelings, values, and topics. But I'll give an example. I was doing a mediation. This was a landlord-tenant mediation just a couple of days ago, and this was also where I had to really confront the process as well, because this was their second session, but I was a new mediator. So normally I would say let's start by just building all the understanding of everything that's going on, which is really important. But I had to kind of skip things ahead to respect their time and the fact that they'd already mediated. Although, so what was at stake in part was a complete factual disagreement. And that turned out to be really important in terms of the dispute. So their perceptions was, let's say, one person was basically waiting for the other person to do a bunch of paperwork and file some things with institutions and governments. I have to leave this very vague because it's confidentiality, of course. But basically, one person was very upset because they're like, look, you said you were going to file all this paperwork and you didn't. And the other person was trying to express but failing to articulate that they had tried to file the paperwork, but they had a lot of technical issues. They're not good with computers. Their son was helping them. So, and I'm not going to say I necessarily pulled this off in the best way. I always struggle with neutrality when I'm reflecting these positions. But at some point, I basically was like, well, I have to give voice to this person. There was also some language barrier issues, really power dynamics. So that person was just having trouble like speaking for themselves. So I kind of just reflected both of their positions as they saw it and said, I think what I'm seeing going on here is that you have different understandings. Sounds like you're saying this happened, sounds like you're saying that happened. And that really opened up some movement in the mediation in a really productive way. And then we kind of moved forward from there and got into problem solving.
Yeah.
And I just don't think I could have gotten there with feelings, values, or topics alone, because there's something about someone trying to say, this is what I believe happened.
Yeah. I
Not
think, can
totally
I,
comfortable with it, but yeah.
yeah, can I share just an observation? And I don't know if this is correct or not, but I think,
Please
you
do.
know, one of the reasons why the feelings and values in particular are so powerful is because, like, you know, you can't decide how I feel. You can't decide what my values are. Like, so when you reflect that back, it's true for that person and it can't really be disputed. And I think, you know, in the example that I shared, there was some disagreement about whether this, you know, manager had scoffed or not.
Right.
Whereas in the situation that you're describing, it sounds like there might have been some agreement about the paperwork. And so, like,
Yeah.
reflecting their positions about it was more safe because they already had that baseline of agreement.
Yeah, and I definitely did a lot of hedging to say, like, I'm just trying to get out of the fact of what you're saying your perspective is. Although that's also very much baked into the model here in Chicago, which is going to be a reflection of the different types of cases. So the Maryland cases are often a lot more relationship based. I mean, they may have or often have a court case involved, versus a lot of the mediations in Chicago are a lot more what we would call in this class distributive in nature. They're about dollars and cents, that people may not see each other again, which isn't to say feelings and values don't matter. They all still play a huge role, especially when you're dealing with landlord-tenant stuff in the middle of a pandemic, right? These people want to know how things are impacting the person. Anyway, so I'm still 95% on that boat, although I'm recognizing the time, so I want to wrap this up, but I want to ask one last question. So you have kind of an amazing perspective. You're like a fly on the wall in so many organizational situations when people are at their best, when people are at their worst. You're mediating, but you're watching people negotiate. You're watching them doing it well. You're watching them doing it poorly. I'm just wondering, what advice do you have for my students, you know, future managers and employees and entrepreneurs? What advice do you have for them in terms of negotiating well and making good decisions with their peers?
I think the best advice that I can give is to address things sooner than later. And, you know, at least in the federal government here, you hear the expression at the lowest level. You know, so like rather than letting things escalate and then being like, wow, we're being sued, we should call in a mediator. So I get a question a lot is like, when should we mediate a workplace conflict? And my answer is as soon as you get that first eye roll, as soon as somebody talks back, as soon as you recognize you're not getting the results you want out of that relationship, it's time to get some help, and not to wait until things escalate. So, you know, and in terms of negotiation strategies and, you know, just actually being in those conversations, I think deepening your sense of like curiosity and interest in what's happening for the other person goes such a long way, because it shows your investment in that relationship. And then you start to shift the conversation from, wow, we're working on like us and this relationship rather than the thing. And so sometimes that too can just kind of deepen the level of investment everyone brings to that conversation.
Thanks. So that's really great advice. This has all been really fascinating. I promised myself I'd keep it to 30 minutes and we're at 29. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I love this. I would love to do it again sometime.
All right. I will definitely take you up on that.
Great.
I'm going to stop the recording.